It's been 1 year since the beginning of the genocide in Palestine, with over 42,000 Palestinians murdered, 17,000 of them children. Now, more than ever, it's important that we are teaching Palestine. Joining us on this two-part special episode are Samia Shoman and Rifk Ebeid, interviewed by Jody Sokolower. Samia Shoman and Jody Sokolower are co-coordinators of the Teach Palestine Project at the Middle East Children's Alliance. Samia is a California native with Palestinian roots who has dedicated her career in public education to promoting racial and social justice in the classroom and in broader educational organizations. A longtime high school social science teacher with a special love for working with English learners, she currently serves as an administrator in her school district. Jody is a longtime political activist, educator, writer, and editor. She is the author of Determined to Stay, Palestinian Youth Fight for Their Village, and is also a co-founder of our Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. As managing editor of Rethinking Schools magazine, she also co-edited the award-winning Rethinking Sexism, Gender, and Sexuality in 2016 and edited Teaching the Wars in the Middle East in 2013. Jody has taught middle and high school students, adult English language learners, and teachers. Rifk Ebeid is a Palestinian American Muslim, writer, attorney, and pediatric speech language pathologist. She is the author of 3 children's picture books about Palestine: Birthday Kunafa, You Are the Color, and Baba, What Does My Name Mean? A Journey to Palestine, which was nominated for the 2020 Palestine Book Awards. She is also the producer of I Am from Palestine, an animated short film about the Palestinian American experience in school.
Hi, this is Jody Sokolower from the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. I'm talking with Samia Shoman, who co-coordinates with me the Teach Palestine Project and the Middle East Children's Alliance. Welcome, Samia.
Thank you.
So, even though there's a lot to talk about the current situation around teaching about Palestine, I just wanted to start a little further back in terms of what your experiences were when you were a Palestinian child in the school system. What was that like?
That's a good question. So I was born in San Francisco, but we moved in the middle, I feel like, of second grade. And so I was raised in Sacramento and I finished, middle of second until I graduated high school. And I would say, really thinking back about to my K-12 experience, there was not much included about Palestine, let alone Arabs in general, unless there was some kind of something about like share your country or culture. But explicit lessons, none that I remember. I mean, I think the thing I remember the most about being Palestinian or being Arab going through my experience is that I was in high school when the Gulf War broke out. And Arabs were really painted, right, as the ugly terrorist enemy. And I remember being hyper aware of that. And I think all my education around the Arab world and Palestine specifically came from trips I took back home as a child and into being a teenager and at home. My family was pretty active, especially my dad. And I never really knew how to meld those two worlds because I felt all this pressure to, I don't know, be American, whatever American means, the kind of status quo normal things. And then I was Arab and Palestinian at home. And I don't know, there wasn't a place really for my language or my culture or my being in the system. And as I grew and went to college and then had my eyes open and really could recognize that so many of the 4 eyes of oppression, specifically internalized oppression, I could name that and feel that in so many ways. I think maybe the one experience I hadn't able to talk about, like where I'm from, is when people ask me, like, oh, my name was different. And I went through high school and middle school allowing people to call me Sam because it seemed like Samia was so hard to pronounce, and didn't realize that that was kind of, me giving up part of my identity.
So, I mean, one would have hoped that in the years since you were a child, things would have gotten better. But unfortunately, I don't think they have. And can you talk a little bit about what the experiences, what you know about the experiences of Palestinian and other Arab youth now, especially since October 7th?
Yeah, I mean, I actually do think they've gotten better. I would say, so I have my own kids. I have twins. They're teenagers now. And I'm raising them, right, as full Palestinian, American, Muslim children in this country where there are books that exist that never existed. Even now, like that they're teens, there's children's books that exist that didn't exist when they were babies. Ramadan is super mainstream. When people say like you're fasting Ramadan, like my son, yes, his teammates like knew what that was, and none of them, are Arab or from Arab countries or Muslim countries. I feel like they've had opportunities, maybe not explicit, like, oh, teach us about Palestine, but teach us about your name, or having like name projects where they've got to teach their class that, my daughter's name is Palestine and my son's name is Jihad, where they have ways, like, although it's not always like the best, people's attempts at being more diverse or culturally like relevant and responsive, I feel like has opened up opportunities. While it might not be like explicit teaching about Palestine or the Arab world, there's opportunities for them to bring that to the classroom. That being said, I do feel like after October 7th, people kind of want to wash their hands because nobody knew what to say. No one really knew how to address it. No one knew how to talk about it in the classroom, not with Palestinian youth, less alone Jewish identifying youth of different political ideologies, and all the students in general, whether even if they weren't any of those, like all people living in this country and living in the world are affected by what's happening. And so I think there was a fear because what you saw in the media was always like the kind of polarizing like comments or attitudes, forgetting everybody in the middle who didn't know, wasn't exposed, was horrified at what was happening, trying to contextualize what's happening. Kids and teens, unlike when I was growing up, have so much exposure. There's TikTok, there's Instagram, there's all of these Snapchat, all of this kind of social media where kids are learning about things. And so instead of kind of seeking to understand or opening up space, people decided to not do it. And then people who did do it often faced a lot of backlash for doing it.
So there's a special urgency to teaching about Palestine now, but this isn't a new issue. Several years ago, when California started moving towards an ethnic studies requirement for high school graduation, the State Board of Education assembled a group of ethnic studies educators to develop model curriculum. You were part of that group. When the model curriculum included lessons on Palestine, all hell broke loose. The Zionist attacks on that curriculum were really strong. And then, even though there was a huge struggle about it, eventually the curriculum was eviscerated pretty much. So why did the group decide it was critical to include Palestine? And how does teaching Palestine fit into an ethnic studies framework? Like, why is it really important to include Palestine if you're teaching ethnic studies?
Yeah, so I don't know that. So I feel like more of the inclusion of Palestine in our original curriculum was around including Palestinians, or including, for example, there was a lesson on social movements and solidarity. And under like after you teach social movements, kids could choose to research some kind of social movement. And I remember BDS being on the list. And then there was something around like change agents. And I remember people like Edward Said and maybe Linda Sarsour and Han Ahmad and people that were kind of pro, Rashida Tlaib was in there. And I can't even tell you if there was like a very specific, explicit lesson on Palestine. I feel like it was included in some of the lessons on Arabs or Arab Americans. But what was attacked was, right, you can't have Rashida Tlaib, you can't have Linda Sissour, you can't have BDS. And I don't know that we necessarily explicitly thought about it, because we do think about the struggle in Palestine, just like the struggle in all the other third world people who were part of that third world liberation like struggle should be included. And thinking about ethnic studies being birthed at San Francisco State, and the fact that San Francisco State has an Arab and Muslims, ethnicities, and diasporas program and teaches multiple classes on Palestine and Arab Americans and Muslim Americans and all those intersections. So I think it felt natural to include Arabs specifically in the chapter on Asian American Studies, because we're kind of trying to stick with the core disciplines and then figuring out where to make. And Palestine has been a long time issue, where you can look at so many of the pieces or like core tenets of ethnic studies that we teach and use it as an example, as examples, whether that's settler colonialism, whether that's indigenous land rights, whether that's solidarity, struggle. And so it wasn't so much like here's this whole chapter like on, Palestine, but it's inextricably like linked to so many other pieces. And so that's why we put it there. I don't know that we anticipated the amount of backlash that there was and continues to be. And I think, in general, often what's most fascinating to me is the backlash that whether it's the model curriculum, a specific teacher in a classroom, a school faces, a district faces, it's often not from something a student experienced in an actual class with a classroom teacher. It is these outside organizations, Institute of Curriculum Services, the ADL, the JCRC, who just want to silence any conversation about Palestine, regardless of the context that it's happening in.
It's interesting too, because I think that I agree with you. I think that originally when Palestine was part of it, it wasn't a really thought out, or we didn't have a deep understanding of how important it was to start looking at settler colonialism and comparing settler colonialism here with settler colonialism there. And a lot, it was the attacks that like kind of pushed us and all the ethnic studies teachers and educators to really think on a deeper way about it. I feel like we have a much deeper sense of why Palestine is, how it ties in so directly to talking about ethnic studies in the United States than we did before. It's
100%.
Yeah. So can you give an example or two of what incorporating Palestine into ethnic studies looks like in a classroom, like a high school classroom, an elementary school classroom, what?
I mean, I would say on the most basic level, and where kids can often feel isolated, regardless if they're like in kinder, third grade, fifth grade, middle school, or high school, is the piece around identity and being able to say, I'm from Palestine, and then being told or looked at and say, well, Palestine doesn't exist. Like we made it up in our imagination. But, for me, my parents have a birth certificate that say they were born in Jerusalem, Palestine in 1942. So it's like, I'm from Palestine. Yes, I was born here, but I think, when we ask kids are like, what's your ethnicity? What's your nationality? This dismissiveness around where they're from, or this attack on like, you can't include, the shape of Palestine in your map. So on the most basic, I would say it fits in around identity and accepting that, like, I was born to Palestinian parents. My own kids were born to Palestinian parents. My husband's parents were refugees in the 1948 war. They literally walked from their village to Jordan. And so I would say on the most basic level there, it means including literature by Palestinian authors. It includes, or allowing kids to like bring that in on their own. How about poetry? Like everybody does a poetry unit starting at like very young age. I've been following like a Gaza Poets page on Instagram, and I mean, it is some of the most inspiring at times, gut-wrenching at other times. And I think even like you can read the poem and you may not even need to tell kids where it came out of because it might not mention Gaza specifically. So like how about reading that and then asking kids like, what kind of situation is this describing? Some people might use it to like describe their actual situation living here and then going into the roots of it. So there's so many ways. And I feel like people, I don't know, I shouldn't say like all people, some people just don't know and they don't feel trained and they don't want to mess up and they don't want to be attacked. And I totally understand that because people come heavy and hard. But sometimes I feel like these groups who have spent so much time, so much money, so much this, so much that to silence like the inclusion or identity of young, kids in their most formative years don't understand at the most basic level how dehumanizing like they are and what they are is doing because you're denying someone like their, sense of feeling, agency, and empowerment. We talk about student agency a lot, their voice, their identity. And I don't understand how lawmakers also don't see that and support that, while at the same time, all we do is talk about mental health and wellness in schools. I'm starting my 25th year as a public educator, and especially after the pandemic, we're like, mental health, wellness, what? And it's like, what about our kids? What about my kids? What about when I, was growing up? It's not enough at home. Like you have to, and not just on Palestine, all kids that come from marginalized groups, but especially this. I mean, I will have to say after October 7th, like you have to talk about what's happening in Gaza. You have to talk about there's California curriculum on like human rights and genocide. Like this now needs to be a chapter. Like it's time to revise because you cannot ignore it. And kids know they're watching it. My kids' friends have watched it and they ask questions too, because most mainstream, whether they're artists or models or this or that, are mentioning it on either, whatever side or spectrum. There's a lot of stuff out there.
Well, that's one thing that's really changed is you can't say, I never heard of it. Yeah. Yeah. So at this point, there are educators all over the country who are bringing this up in their classrooms, and many of them who've been teaching about Palestine are facing a backlash. Can you talk about what that looks like and why you think it's happening?
I mean, it looks like people getting like vile hate mail. It looks like them getting harassed online. It looks like them being subject to one-sided like false narratives about themselves. It looks like them being worried about their livelihoods. It looks like them being put on administrative leave. It looks like them not being non-reelected or going through like disciplinary process if they're a tenured teacher. So it looks like a lot of things, and it's all awful. And sorry, the second part of your question is like, why is it happening?
Yeah, why do you think that the backlash has been so awful, so severe, and so widespread?
Because the response to them bringing Palestine up or teaching about what's happening specifically after October 7th is like, just like it's galvanizing the rest of the world and people are realizing how awful what's happening is, like students in a classroom are also realizing. And we see that on the college campuses. This isn't just any college campus. These are the top student. I mean, the encampment started with the top students in the country, the MIT, the Harvards, the Yales. People, it's unlike other times in history, there's so much documentation of what's happening. So instead of the more people are exposed, the more they're going to ask questions. The more they ask questions and the more they go look for themselves and read and kind of find answers for themselves. Like it's happening to intimidate people into silence. For the teacher in whatever, room 12, to see the teacher in room 11 going through so much stress or on the verge of not having a job anymore. So now I'm like, you know what? I'd rather just not, I don't want to deal with it. So it really, at the end of the day, it is to silence, erase, and bury the narratives of Palestinians.
It really does kind of expose teacher unions too, because it's really, teacher unions really have the opportunity here to, I know in the district I taught in, a bunch of teachers were under investigation for actually for supporting students doing an art exhibit during lunch about what was happening in Gaza. And the lawyer for the teachers union told the president to be neutral. It's not the job of a teachers union to be neutral. It's the job of a teachers union to support teachers, especially when they're trying to help their kids figure out what's going on in the world and
Yep.
how to be moral, ethical people. Yeah. So, how do you see the relationship between the censorship of teaching Palestine and other right-wing attacks that are going on, teaching Black history, LGBTQ issues?
I mean, the common thread is marginalized communities in this country, communities that have faced legal, right, marginalization all their life, whether that is from them being able to have marriage rights, to property rights, to their stories and narratives told, like all of the above. So I think they're inextricably linked of like, let's silence all and every narrative. Because it's easier. Attack one, attack them all. Makes it much easier. Where you see some states basically making it against the law to teach about, whatever, slavery, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQA plus communities. I feel like you're also seeing laws starting not to be, like the laws around equating criticizing Israel as being anti-Semitic, right? So as a way to silence the teaching of Palestine, I mean, up to like, you can't say these phrases, right? You can't say from the river to the sea. What a way, that would be a great way to teach geography. How about that? How about understanding the geographical context of that? I think people forget. So I would say that like people are now turning to law to mandate or whatever, what people can't teach instead of mandating what they should be teaching. So we're really seeing this shift in like, instead of us saying like, you should be teaching all these things, now we're going to impose these right-wing laws on like, you can't teach these things.
And one of the things about Palestine is in terms of Black Lives Matter or queer stuff, that the Democrats set themselves up in opposition to the Republicans as the defenders of being able to talk about social justice issues. But around Palestine, there's much more of an alliance between the right wing of the Democratic Party and even what they call the mainstream of the Democratic Party and the right wing. And it's only more courageous politicians who are willing to fight for Palestine.
But it's also like that, with educators as well. I feel like people are willing to go to board meetings or set up task forces, or when Black Lives Matter started to happen, like people want to teach about it. People weren't shy about bringing it in the classroom. People weren't. But when it comes to Palestine, it's like, ooh, that's different. It's, this, it's that. And so I feel like in general, with both, it's one thing, right? The political parties, but just with people who consider themselves progressive educators, except for Palestine.
Yeah. So I know as a Palestinian parent, you've really thought a lot about how to talk to your kids, how to try to advocate for your kids at school so it's a safe place for them during this period of time. And in more general terms, how do you think Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and even parents of other pro-Palestinian students can protect their children in these difficult times?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I feel like parents need, or, caretakers, kids, families, and communities need to start getting involved at the local level. They need to attend school board meetings. They need to pay attention to policies that are being passed. They need to understand they have a right to make public comment at board meetings. They have a right to email the principals of schools and the superintendents of schools and school board meetings. I think they have to ask and demand what they want our students to learn about in school. It's a lot easier, right? If you're involved and you show up to, schools. I think you have to take books to the library that you want to see. I think, I know my kids had a cultural festival and they had all the flags up of all the different countries, but they didn't have a Palestine flag. So we took a Palestine flag and we're like, you need to put this up. You can't tell us you're not going to put our flag up when we're having a booth. And they did put it up and they saved it for the following year. And we did have to ask where we donated a flag last year. Where is it? My husband got up on the ladder, but we also have rights and people need to understand that. I know growing up, I mean, my parents were immigrants. They didn't know. And it was the school is right. The school is right. And I like to think, I'm a school administrator that most of the time we are right, but not all the time. And, I'm here to provide a service. I work for my students and the families. I don't work for myself, so I don't get to decide. They need to tell us, what they want. And so I would really say, get to know the school policies, go in the handbooks. There are uniform complaint procedures. There are non-discrimination, rules and clauses, both at the state level, the federal level. So we also have to use those to protect our kids.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to be protected otherwise.
Yeah. That's right. So what about teachers and administrators? So first of all, what's our responsibility to our students, and how can we be protecting our classrooms, our schools, and our districts from Zionist attacks during this period of time?
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to kind of what I was just talking about, which is we serve the students and families that belong to our district. And although we are, at least in my case, we work in public educational institutes, which opens it up to outside groups and all these things. And, public records requests and all those things that time suck us. At the end of the day, we're beholden to the students who sit in our classrooms. And so, yes, sometimes we are going to have, families with different perspectives, and we need to listen to all of those. That's our job. And we need to know what our values are and make decisions and support teachers that align with those values. Values don't get to we can't just write we are a school that promotes equity and diversity and justice and anti-racist policies, and then but we're not going to talk about Palestine, or we're not going to allow these students to have this fundraiser, or we're not going to allow you to bring your flag, or whatever it is. So it's really pushing on what are our values and how are we going to make student-centered decisions that align with those values. And when there is these events October 7th, right? All of a sudden people are oh, October 7th. I'm this has been going on forever. And I understand you. Yes. Okay. October 7th. Yes. Now it's, what are we in June? And the genocide is still happening. So yes, let's talk about it. Let's recognize and let's contextualize. And I think that's the most important thing, I guess I would want teachers and administrators to know. Can you please contextualize what's happening and look at the small and the big picture? Because at the end of the day, our job is to make sure our students are coming to a safe, inclusive space on our campuses, and that they are learning the critical thinking, the critical media, the critical reading skills to be able to make sense of the world around them. We don't need to tell them what to believe and how to believe, but I think if we address the skills, then they can make sense of the world as they need to. And that takes courage, and it takes not being scared, and it takes not wanting to worry about the attacks if and when, they come. And I get that, honestly, I've met teachers and administrators that are not so much administrators specifically afraid of, say, the attacks, but it is a time suck. They will turn all your attention to suck up all the time in writing responses and meetings and PRAs so that you're then like, oh my God, I'm running a district, I'm running a school, I'm running a classroom.
Yeah. I just wanted to add one thing around contextualizing, which I think is really important. I think a lot around Gaza, contextualizing means it did not start October 7th.
Yep.
You know, that you can't understand Gaza unless you're looking at least from the beginning of the siege and probably from 1948.
100%. And, the
Or
line,
1897.
yeah, I mean, the line kind of has been, right? Well, there was peace on October 6th, was there? There was also open air prison with 1.8 million people trapped inside of it with no access to this and this and that. And let's talk about all the other attacks, like every two for, yes. Yep. I can
Yeah.
go on and on. So I think, but that is an easy line, right? That you train people on. And again, for the vast majority, we forget because we're in it and we know so much, right? And we've been there and I've seen and all those pieces. But I think for the mass majority of, Americans, they don't know and they haven't heard and they haven't learned, just like I didn't learn. They also didn't learn, right? My classmates didn't learn. All the kids at my school didn't learn. Like the peers and friends of my parents who are now asking questions and like learning from me, they didn't learn. So it's not that they don't believe or they just didn't learn. And now
Well,
they're playing catch up to get that context.
this is an international learning opportunity.
100. But the rest of the world is learning faster than we are.
Yeah. Okay, so is there anything else I should have asked or you would like to talk about?
I would just say that, at the end of the day, all I am asking is for people to see my humanity, the humanity of my kids, and the humanity of every kid that is sitting in a classroom, whether it's the Palestine issue or whatever, the Black Lives Matter issue or the immigration issue or the, legal status issue, or we are human beings that are tied or should be tied together by our humanity. And I feel like that is the most important job of educators.
Thank you so much. So we were talking with Samia mostly about working with high school and middle school students on learning about Palestine and making the environment safe for them. Now we're going to talk with Rifk Ebeid, who's a Palestinian American Muslim writer, attorney, and pediatric speech language pathologist. Rifk is the author of 2 children's picture books about Palestine, You're the Color and Baba, What Does My Name Mean? A Journey to Palestine, which was nominated for the 2020 Palestine Book Awards. She's also the producer of I Am from Palestine, an animated short film about the Palestinian American experience in school. And I think this part of the podcast is really important because learning about Palestine and being a Palestinian child in school doesn't start in high school, it starts really young. So welcome, Rifk.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The media is filled with images of the devastation in Gaza and dominated by Zionist versions of what's happening. What is the impact on young children, and how should parents and educators be supporting children, especially young children, during this period?
So I know, like, from personal experience with my kids, they've been talking about Palestine much more because they see us constantly scrolling our phones or listening to the news, or just us talking about it with each other, like the adults. And even my 4-year-old, he's constantly talking about it and asking questions and asking what's happening, what's going on in that video, what are you watching? And you can see that it impacts them because it's their daily lived experience of that being, just all surrounding them. And even in their art that they're drawing, it's constant Palestine flags or like a Palestinian flag fighting with the Israeli flag or something like that. Like that's how they're processing it. Like they're doing it through their art. And I've seen it like at my kids' school in different art projects they've done. They include the flag somehow. So I definitely know that it impacts them, but they obviously, for younger kids, they obviously don't realize how much of a historic moment that we're in. But I know that this is going to be something that they will remember as they get older, because I myself remember when the first two intifadas happened, and those left, imprints in my mind. And so what we teach the kids now is going to make a long-lasting impression for them when they grow. So I think it's important for us to have these conversations with them and not to shield them from what they're watching or what we're watching, because they see like it's something that's part of who we are, and we can't shield them from that. And I don't think it's fair to shield them from that, especially for Palestinian children. These are their brothers and sisters that are getting slaughtered. And I think that the least we can do is teach our kids about it.
What led you to write Baba, What Does My Name Mean? And did you have specific goals in mind, what you were hoping it would accomplish?
Oh gosh, where do I start? So my entire life I was a student activist. And then when I graduated after law school, I thought to myself, what can I do outside of the student world as an activist, but not in the traditional activist route? Because I found that that wasn't something that I felt that I thrived in or wanted to continue doing. But I still knew I had a lot to say. So I was trying to think of what are different ways where you can keep teaching and educating the masses that doesn't necessarily involve what traditional activism does, like constant speaking and advocacy and travel and stuff like that. And so I thought of a children's book, but at the time I wasn't a parent yet. So it wasn't really coming to me. Like I was trying to come up with a story, but you could just tell it wasn't the right time. And then I got involved in a project when I was living overseas where I was part of this international book fair. And that kind of first exposed me to this world of children's books, because there were so many vendors and they had like an illustrator's corner, and it was really amazing. And then when I became a parent, that's what kind of really gave me the motivation and pushed me, because I named my kids after different Palestinian cities. And so I knew one day they would ask me, what does my name mean? And from myself, my own experience growing up, I had a quote unquote weird name that nobody understood. Even other Arabs didn't understand it. So I felt like that was a title or a storyline that a lot of people would relate to and would connect with. And so that's kind of where the title came from, because I really wanted kids to just be proud of their name, even if they're the only ones in the world with that name, and even if the only ones in their community, and just to understand that, especially for Palestinian families, we don't take these names lightly. Like there's a lot of thought and consideration put for any family, honestly, but for us especially, there's a lot of thought and consideration being put in our names, and maintaining our culture and our identity. And so that's kind of what started it. And then also growing up, I got the chance to visit Palestine every summer because my family still lives there. And so I just remember every memory that I have as a child it's only in Palestine. Like I don't remember anything else from throughout the year. And so I wanted kids to have that same experience. So kids that aren't able to go there, I wanted them to feel like they really got to know, what is Palestine? What is it that I'm supposed to be proud of? What is this identity that I feel connected to or feel very strongly about? Just to know Palestine beyond the surface. And so Baba, What Does My Name Mean is kind of like a guidebook throughout Palestine, so that you feel like you got to travel there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
There's been an explosion of books about Palestine for young children by Palestinian authors in the past few years. And many of the books, including Baba, What Does My Name Mean, focus on Palestinian culture, as you were just explaining. Often the Israeli occupation's in the background or not mentioned. Why are authors taking this approach with young kids?
So I can't speak for other authors, but for myself, I know that my work is still laced with the politics. Like I do want to show both sides because nobody ever talks about our culture. We're always talked about in a political sense, and that's a form of dehumanization. So that could be a reason for why we really heavily focus on culture, because we exist beyond Zionism. And but I feel for myself, I always try and incorporate both with my books, because you can't detach us from what's happening to us. So our culture now is also shaped by what's happening to us. And actually, in my most recent book, I had one that came out in late January. It's called Birthday Kunafa. I don't know if you got a chance to see it. It's this
No, I
one.
haven't seen it yet. Oh, wow.
And Birthday
I love
Kunafa.
Kanafa.
Yeah, I know. There's a recipe in the back. It's a wordless picture book, and I really love that as a speech therapist, because there's so many angles you can take with a wordless book, and it can be used with so many different age groups and can tackle so many goals in terms of language. But also, this book it actually addresses the occupation. My other books, one was about the Nakba, and the Baba, What Does My Name Mean? It talks in general about why can't we be free and what made me a refugee. But Birthday Kunafa specifically addresses life under Israeli occupation for a Palestinian girl from Jerusalem, and she's trying to get to Nablus for the best kunafa in town. And so I have a section in the back that it's called Context Matters, and it teaches the kids what is an occupation, what does it mean to be occupied, because we use that terminology and vocabulary a lot, but you don't see it ever explained for children. And so I think that some people might shy away from it because of publishing issues. They're fearful that it won't get published if it addresses those things. Also, I've heard parents talk about they don't like to expose their kids to too much violence. So they might not want to have their kids read something that has a more difficult concept to talk about, because it requires you as the parent to also be educated on the topic so that you can flesh it out more with your kids. So there's a lot of reasons, a lot of layers about why the books might be focusing on certain things as opposed to others. But I do definitely think a lot of it will have to do with, if you're getting traditionally published, you might have a more difficult time to really address everything on its face. But I have heard from other people whose books are coming out that they weren't edited or sanitized in their content. So it might be shifting. I don't know, but
I hope so.
yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. So You Are the Color is a story about the Nakba and the forcible expulsion of almost 800,000 Palestinians and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So in terms of this discussion about fleshing things out and helping kids understand difficult subject matter, what has your experience been reading the book with children or using it in classrooms? I know you're not a teacher, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I have had the chance to read it to a group of children, and it was actually really hard for me because I hadn't read it in a while when I did go read to them, and I choked up, and I didn't think I would, but you feel that energy as you're reading it, because the story really takes you into that experience, especially, well, I don't want to ruin it for whoever might read it, but especially when you get to the really difficult parts where the little kid is trying to find joy in his space, and the mom is still, she hasn't been able to process what has happened to them. And it was really tough for me to read it. And then, but the kids are amazing. The kids are engaged and they asked really nice questions, like very intuitive, very curious. And then I also had a chance to read it to a group of adults, so students who were learning to become teachers. And they had a lot of great questions. And we also got to come up with lesson plan samples together. And they had some brilliant ideas, even things I hadn't thought of to use it for. And so I've had a really positive experience with it. And with the kids, especially, I'm just always blown away by how they get it. Kids are very smart and they understand the idea of fair and unfair.
And they're
And
kind of hardwired for empathy. That's,
yeah,
yeah,
yes. I was
young
going to say
kids.
they don't have those stereotypes yet in their head that clouds how they see people.
Yeah.
And so they understand the situation on itself without judging who it's happening to, or like, or what they know about the people that they're reading about. I did have one of the student teachers ask, how do you think a Jewish student would feel if they had to hear your book being read to them? And I found the question really off-putting because, one, it centers somebody else versus the actual person being talked about in the story. It doesn't center the Palestinian at all, which is what the whole story is about. And then also it assumes that only a Jewish student would somehow feel something, whether negative or positive, when reading the book. And so that was the only odd question I received. It's not odd, it's expected. But what I tell them is, this is a Palestinian experience, and this did happen to them. And I can't be responsible for how somebody else feels when they learn about history. And this is a fact. Zionism is real. So I'm not gonna not talk about it and keep my language vague. Because in the book it says before the Zionists took our home. So they were concerned about that phrase. And so it's just, we have to just keep pushing the fact that, these are our lived experiences and we don't have to water it down because somebody might be uncomfortable by that. They should feel uncomfortable about what happened to people, that something that's wrong that happened to people, regardless of who we are. So.
Right. And, there's so much talk these days from Zionists about what's going to make a classroom situation feel unsafe for Jewish kids, and being uncomfortable or being pushed to rethink things. That's part of learning. That doesn't make you, having someone take your home makes you unsafe. Having to think about things in a larger perspective, that's about growing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's always weird for me as a Palestinian for somebody to ask that and say, what if they might feel unsafe when we literally are unsafe?
Yeah.
We are literally physically unsafe here in the US and in Palestine and all around the world. We are literally hearing instances of hate crimes against Palestinians throughout the diaspora. So it's odd. It's just an odd thing to ask when you're literally not experiencing it like us.
Yep. So what can teachers and teacher leaders do to make sure that, like, pulling back from just, from this book, and I mean, obviously one of the things that we want teachers to do is to have many books about Palestine in their classrooms, and this comes up around all different kinds of subjects, gay issues, racism in general, that like if you have one book, it's about representation. If you're really trying to help students have a broad sense, you need a lot of books about
Mhm.
different subjects. But aside from expanding their libraries, what can teachers and teacher leaders do to make sure that Palestinian and other Arab youth feel welcomed and safe at school? Speaking of safety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they need to be more informed about things that affect Palestinian students, because what I find is they just don't know. And so they're completely unaware that this activity or this issue might impact us. And that's what we touched upon in our animation, I'm from Palestine, because a lot of teachers will be excited to do this. Hey, everyone, let's share where we're from. Let's look at the map. And they don't realize that some people might not find themselves represented on the map, and how that what that causes for them, especially as a kid. So I think just be informed, read about the subject, be aware of the history as much as you can. Sure, it's a long history, but it's just not as complicated as, people want you to feel like it is. A lot of times that helps shut down any even attempt to read about Palestine, because you just think like, oh, it's too complicated, I'll never get it. But no, you can get it. And that's why a good starting point is our children's books, because they're very basic. And the children's books, there's, like you said, there's so many now out about Palestine, and they're simple enough just to give you some exposure to topics that, relate to us. And so I think those are a good starting point. I myself was worried when I wanted to give my first book to teachers, and I actually never thought it would be used in a classroom. That was way past my idea for the book. I just thought some Palestinian families might buy it. And so I'm amazed that it's used in a classroom, because in my experience, nobody wants to touch this topic, because you can literally get fired for it. And so teachers really that's why they have to be well informed and aware, so that they can't be bullied into silence.
That's right. Okay. Thank you so much, Rifk. Are there other things that you wanted to say before we do you have any parting
Um,
words?
Parting words. One of the themes that I try and tackle throughout all my books is just like I said before, is the importance of education. And I always say that starts with us. I've been studying this pretty much my whole life, and I am Palestinian, and I still feel like there's so much more I need to know. And so I always feel like the biggest thing that people should do is education. And that starts with yourself. And as far as my books, I do have one more book coming out soon, hopefully in the next few months, that I'm very excited about. It's about the key of return, and I can't wait to show everybody. So be on the lookout for that. And I hope that, whoever is watching, educator or whoever's listening, an educator or a parent, please, please, please use these books and our film as a resource to help teach Palestine. That's why I made them. That's what I do now. I don't get nervous, because I just think, oh, okay, I'll grab my book, grab my cartoon, good to go. And it really helps you have this baseline starting point.
Thank you so much.
You can find the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, and check out our website at ethnicstudies-coalition.org, where you can find more tools, merch, and information and resources mentioned on this episode and on our podcast in general. We're a growing movement, and if what you heard in this episode inspires you, we invite and highly encourage you to become a CLEAS member and spread the word to your folks. Donations for this podcast are always welcome, needed, and appreciated. You can donate online on our website at ethnicstudies-coalition.org. Learning Liberation, the Ethnic Studies podcast, is produced by members of the podcast team of the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies. Our theme music was produced by Coalition member Sharif. Our podcast art is designed by Coalition core member and podcast co-host me, J.R. Adamwanga. From the front lines in the classroom to the front lines in the streets, sending revolutionary love and solidarity your way.